When Thomas Bridger realized his error, the hewn log still had the scent of fresh pine sap. In October of 1827, the 34-year-old trapper had recently completed building what he believed to be a legitimate smokehouse at his winter camp in the modern-day Wyoming Wind River Range. It had a pyramid roof and was 8 feet square, exactly like the ones he'd spotted in Kentucky 5 years prior to moving west. The building appeared sturdy. The spaces between the logs were chinked with clay and moss. The door was a tight fit. However, once he ignited the fire and put his first batch of elk quarters inside, something went wrong. Fire. Instead of flowing uniformly around the meat, the smoke billowed. Straight up, then out through openings he had missed. The temperature inside rose so high in just 3 hours. That fat was accumulating on the earthen floor after dripping from the meat. They weren't preserving the elk. It was being cooked. Additionally, 200 meters from the closest trading post, this area's lost meat meant the difference between starving before the spring thaw and surviving the winter. What Thomas had no idea that he was going to learn a method that would completely alter his life on that October afternoon. He was aware of how to preserve meat. Neither a book nor another white trapper would provide the information. It would originate in winter from a Shoshoni elder named Stans, who had been silently observing the white man's clumsy attempts to laughter from the other side of the valley. The technique Stans would teach him in the winter method of constructing and running a smokehouse that seems to go against all Thomas believed he knew would. Permit him to preserve acceptable meat for 2 whole seasons, not just 1 winter. This is the tale of how a single error resulted in a revelation that mountaineers would silently discuss among themselves for the next 20 years. A method so successful that meat preserved in this manner could be transported thousands of miles without going bad. Nourish a whole brigade for 2 harsh winters, and transform a poor free trapper into one of the finest prominent vendors in the fur trade in the Rocky Mountains. Instead of starting with success, the narrative opens with the sort of failure in the mountains that might be fatal. In 1822, Thomas Bridger had traveled west as a member of William Ashley's Up the Missouri River on the second voyage. He was 29 years old and robust from years of agricultural labor, and wholly unprepared for the demands of alpine life. The initial 2 winters taught him things that reading alone could not have imparted. Along with other trappers, he had shared their camps and taken advantage of their expertise. However, by 1826, he had saved sufficient from his beaver pelts to attempt a free trap, working alone, keeping all earnings, but also having to every danger. Working alone meant resolving all issues on his own. Know when the creeks froze, a buddy helped set traps. When difficulty arose on the ridge, there was no second gun and no experienced hand to impart to him the 100 minor abilities that distinguished successful mountaineers from those who failed to return to the rendezvous. Meat preservation was one of those abilities, and Thomas had persuaded himself that he knew what it was. He had observed meat being smoked by other trappers. How difficult could it be? In 1827, the Wind River Range was ideal for trapping. Country, accessible enough for a single trapper to work, yet far enough away that beaver populations remained dense. The streams without keeping a close eye on his back. Thomas had meticulously selected a protected valley with a southern aspect that received the most sunlight during the brief winter days, plenty of timber, and abundant water. He had constructed a sturdy 14-foot square log cabin with a stone hearth. He had laid in an ample supply of wood for burning. After scouting the area, he found a little elk, herd that stayed in the valley for the winter. The smokehouse had appeared to be the last element of his planning. He had filled after removing the branches from 8 straight pines. They were notched into a tight square. The building was 8 feet high, had a peaked roof that rose an additional 2 feet, and walls that were 6 feet high. He had departed from the thinking that any fat that dripped would just seep into the ground, treating the floor as packed soil. Near each wall's summit, to allow smoke to escape, he would make ventilation slits 4 inches wide. The door was 3 feet high, broad, made of split pine planks that are secured with leather hinges. Within, he'd positioned a number of horizontal rods at varying elevations so they could hold meat. He prepared the fire pit by excavating a shallow dip that is roughly 2 feet across and 6 inches deep in the middle of the dirt floor. He had used flat stones from the brook to line it. It was an easy strategy. Create a tiny green wood fire that would smolder and emit copious amounts of smoke, then suspend the meat from the above poles and allow the smoke to do its magic for a few days. He'd seen it done that way back home. Thomas was unaware that Kentucky smokehouse was governed by entirely distinct circumstances. It wasn't 7,000 feet above sea level in Kentucky. October weather in Kentucky didn't alternate between chilly evenings and warm afternoons. Green pine logs were not used to construct Kentucky smokehouses, still shed tears of sap. And the farmers in Kentucky who constructed those smokehouses had honed their methods throughout generations, adding seemingly insignificant elements that turned out to be crucial. As soon as Thomas ignited his, he used pine for the first fire that October afternoon in 1827, as it was everywhere, and his smokehouse was constructed out of pine. Inside, he suspended 4 elk parts, each weighing roughly 40 lb, hung from the poles using rawhide cords that were inserted through holes in the meat. He waited for the smoking process to finish, shut the door, and took a step back. Within 1 hour, issues appeared. He had planned to keep the fire small and smoky, but it continued to try to ignite. Pine burnt quickly and hotly, while it's green. The wood's resin produced thick, foul-smelling, acrid smoke. Thomas expanded the number of green branches to put out the fire, but that only increased the intensity of the smoke. Through every opening, the dense white smoke flowed out. Around the door frame, through the ventilation openings, and even through the gaps between the logs in the building, he believed he had sealed correctly. Thomas's heart fell when he opened the door to see how he was doing at the 3rd hour. The beef was in the process of cooking. The surface was now dark brown, with patches of blackness. Fat slowly trickled across the stones below, where it sizzled and gave the already acrid pine smoke a charred stench. He extended his hand and made contact. A quarter of an elk. It felt hot to the touch outside. He used his knife to chop into it, and the meat close to the eye. Instead of the deep red hue of properly smoked meat, the surface was gray and cooked. After removing the meat, Thomas left it outside to cool. He sat outside his smokehouse after letting the fire go out, attempting to determine what went wrong. His predicament was starting to make sense mathematically. He had defeated 3 days prior to that elk. He was hanging outdoors with about 160 pounds of meat. Without appropriate preservation, that even in chilly conditions, meat would start to deteriorate in a matter of days. Whether in October, it would be hard for him to consume it all. He could make jerky by slicing it into thin strips. But the nights were growing chilly enough that it would be unpleasant to work outside for the necessary number of hours, and he had previously squandered half a day trying to smoke. When Thomas awoke the following morning, he discovered frost on the ground and about 50 yards away from his cabin, a Shoshoni man is sitting cross-legged. The man was elderly, perhaps 60 or 70, wearing a buffalo robe in spite of the early morning light. The valley is beginning to warm. At least he wasn't carrying a weapon. He simply sat and observed the cabin. Shoshoni was not the first person Thomas had met. The tribe tended to have amicable relations with American trappers, in contrast to the northern Blackfoot, who had been antagonistic since the voyage of Lewis and Clark 20 years prior. However, seeing an elderly man seated outside it was eerie in the cottage before morning. With his rifle in hand but not elevated, Thomas went outdoors. He gave a nod. The elderly man gave a nod, back. Both were silent for a long time. The elderly man then pointed to the in-Shoshone smokehouse and said something. Although Thomas was not fluent in the language, the gesture was quite obvious. The elderly man had observed. He had observed the unsuccessful attempt to smoke meat. He had most likely been watched this white trapper set up his camp for the winter. The events that followed would fundamentally alter Thomas's perspective on meat preservation. The elderly man. He got up, walked over to the smokehouse, and motioned for Thomas to come. Thomas paused, and the man just opened the door of the smokehouse and peered inside. He touched the green planks of pine. He looked into the fire pit. He examined the ventilation slots above. He then shook his head and started talking, adding hand motions to the words that Thomas was unable to comprehend. During the course of the following hour, using a mix of pantoum, dirt drawings, and using a straightforward demonstration, Stanson and Winter outlined Thomas's mistakes and the necessary adjustments. The lesson started with the fireplace. The elderly man pointed to the tiny pit that Thomas had excavated, in the middle of the floor of the smokehouse. Shaking his head, he started to leave the smokehouse while keeping track of his steps. He halted after 15 steps and gestured to the floor. He then made a digging motion and used it to draw a line in the dirt. Back to the smokehouse. Spot. It was an obvious message. There should be no fire within the smokehouse. Thomas was perplexed. The fire was located within the same building as the meat in every smokehouse he had ever seen. How could you? Where else can I use a fire to smoke meat? In winter, however, Stans remained adamant. He started displaying what Thomas should create after pacing off the 15 paces once more. Thomas had never seen a design so drastically different. The fire pit ought to be excavated outside the smokehouse, around 2 feet broad and 3 feet deep in the ground. There should be a trench that runs from this outdoor fire pit, subterranean, sloping gently upward toward the smokehouse. The trench's dimensions should be roughly 10 inches by 12 inches, deep, with flat stones lining it. This trench ought to join a gap at the smokehouse wall's base where the smoke would go inside. Fresh air would be able to enter through another opening close to the floor at the opposite wall. The smoke would escape through ventilation openings at the top. However, it was crucial that the smoke pass through this underground passageway, chilling significantly before it came into contact with the meat. The rationale for this design evolved into evident, while Stan and Winter carried on with his performance. By keeping the fire apart, you could regulate the temperature from the meat chamber without affecting the generation of smoke. You might construct a large flame that emitted a lot of smoke, but by the time it passed 15 feet into an underground stone passage, the temperature would drop from several hundred degrees to just warm. The meat would never cook and spend hours or perhaps days surrounded by chilly smoke. For the next 3 days, Thomas was totally rebuilding his smoking apparatus. He excavated the outside fire pit precisely where Stan's and Winter had pointed out, digging far down till he found a stone. 3-foot-deep lined chamber. He carefully sloped the connecting trench uphill toward the smokehouse as he dug it. He made a line using flat stones from the creek. He fitted them as closely as he could in the trench. He made a fresh cut in the base and installed stones that matched the trench on the smokehouse wall. He made another hole in the wall across from it for the intake of air. After laying split logs over the trench, he covered the entire tunnel with soil to insulate it. However, Stanson Winter's teaching career was far from over. The wood itself was the subject of the following lesson. The elderly Shoshoni guy was trembling. When Thomas sought for further pine branches, he firmly held his head. Rather, Stanson he found a stand of cottonwood trees beside the creek during the winter. He began chopping off particular branches rather than any tree, but from certain types. Thomas deduced through gestures that the wood should be aged and lifeless, but not rotten, from specific tree species, and for a minimum of 2 years. Aspen, willow, and cottonwood were all appropriate. Pine and additional conifers weren't. After Thomas gave it some thought, the explanation became clear. Pine and the dense, bitter smoke he had experienced was created by different reinous trees. Creosote and other substances found in conifers. Instead of preserving meat, smoke may cause it to taste bitter and perhaps deteriorate. Hardwoods such as willow and cottonwood added tastes that complemented each other, burnt cooler and created cleaner smoke. Complemented the meat instead of overpowering it. There was more. Winter stands illustrated the correct method for smoking meat. All Thomas had done was cut the elk in quarters and hang the parts. Complete. The elderly man gave a headshake. He produced a knife and demonstrated how to chop the meat, not into quarters, but into 1-foot-long, 3-inch-thick pieces. These strips ought to be partially dried first, then let to hang outside for a day or two until a tacky layer known as a pelly formed on the top. Only then should the smokehouse be used for the meat. It became evident why this preparation was necessary. Smoke does not take well to wet meat. Meat that has been air-dried for a day can still absorb smoke chemicals because of the moisture on the surface. Or two created that tacky pelle, which did in fact draw and retain smoke. Fragments. As a result, the meat was able to absorb preservative chemicals and smoke taste considerably more efficiently. Next, when the lesson on salting arrived, Thomas became acutely aware of how little he had understood. Stands during the winter. Didn't have salt to use as a demonstration, but he made it apparent that salt was essential with deliberate movements. The meat. It is best to rub the strips well with salt before smoking, not after. Thomas had considered smoking as a substitute to seasoning. Winter stands demonstrated to him how salting and smoking complemented one another. By drawing moisture out of the meat, salt created an environment that prevented bacteria from growing. On the meat's exterior, the smoke left behind substances that further prevented bacterial growth and provided preservative impacts. Salt and smoke combined to produce meat that was not only weeks, months, or with good care, years. The fourth day following that, Thomas was prepared to try again after his first unsuccessful attempt. Stanson said that he had completely reconstructed his smoking system. The design of winter. Several bundles of old cottonwood branches had been collected by him. He had cooked fresh meat from a different elk. He had cut it into appropriate pieces and allowed them to air dry for 2 days before they acquired the sticky surface. 5 miles away, he had given a Shoshoni camp a steel knife in return for. He had thoroughly massaged each piece of beef with the 3 pounds of salt they had collected from a natural salt spring. Valuable mineral. Everything was different when Thomas ignited the fire in his exterior pit this time. He constructed a large fire with the old cottonwood, allowing it to burn to hot coals before adding more green wood to produce smoke. As it passed down the subterranean passage, the smoke cooled before entering the smokehouse through the ground-level aperture. The temperature inside the smokehouse remained cold, only slightly warmer, compared to the ambient air. The dangling slices of beef were evenly surrounded by smoke, progressively ascending in the direction of the upper ventilation slots. On the first day, Thomas checked the meat every couple of hours. The strips were turning a rich shade of reddish-brown. The surface was still solid, but not cooked. They were chilly when he touched them. The scent was quite different. Clean and attractive instead of acrid and incorrect from his first effort. In order to keep the smoke flowing steadily, he added seasoned cottonwood to the fire every several hours for 3 whole days, via the tunnel. He allowed the fire to burn to coals at night, but there was still enough smoke to keep the lower-level procedure. The flesh had changed at the end of the 3rd day. The strips had a slightly malleable interior, but a rigid, dry outside. They acquired a deep burgundy hue and a heady, smoky scent that elevated Thomas's salivation. He removed one strip and used his knife to chop into it. The meat was sufficiently dry and completely preserved that it wasn't too dry to eat, but not so dry that bacteria couldn't thrive. He chewed a tiny portion after cutting it. The taste was smoky, salty, and powerful, without the bitterness that pine smoke had added. This pork was thoroughly smoked, the kind that would endure throughout spring after winter. Inside his hut, Thomas hung the completed meat from bugs and moisture. In the next week, he processed an additional elk and in the winter, deer that used the technique to smoke more than 200 pounds of meat had instructed him. He experimented with changes as well. He experimented with various wood combinations and discovered that adding little, the flavor of the cottonwood was enhanced by the addition of sagebrush. He conducted a test, adjusting the salt concentrations, and found that longer preservation times were achieved with more salting, but made the meat that hasn't been soaked beforehand becomes less appetizing. The 1827-1828 winter season demonstrated the value of the method. In addition to lasting through that winter, Thomas's smoked meat continued to do so well into the summer of the next year. When he still had perfectly good venison from the previous October when he went to the 1828 rendezvous at Bear Lake in July, edible. Other trappers took notice. Men who had been in the campfire when Thomas shared part of his preserved meat. For years, the mountains questioned how he had preserved meat for so long. Although he didn't provide every detail, Thomas shared the method. Specifics. He informed trappers about the underground tunnel and outdoor fire pit. He described the use of hardwoods rather than pine. Although he stressed the value of salt rubbing, he retained parts of Stan's and Winter's more subdued teachings to himself. The precise slope of the smoke, the significance of the pele, and the manner in which the meat should be cut tunnel. Still, word got out. By the rendezvous in 1829, a number of trappers had constructed smokehouses with outdoor fire pits. By 1830, the layout was starting to norm for free trappers who set up permanent camps for the winter. Thomas's distant relative Jim Bridger, who'd been using the method, trapping in the area since 1822, and allegedly informed fellow trappers that it was the most useful piece of real-world knowledge he had acquired in the mountains.